Welcome to the day 2 of the Southeast Asia Internet Governance Forum. This is breakout room 5, and we will be discussing cyber norms operationalization in ASEAN, a session hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Jakarta, Indonesia. My name is Balthazar Krisatya. I'm with CSIS Indonesia, and before we proceed with the breakout session, we'll be reading the sort of room rules. Before that, I want to say welcome to the audience, to all the attendees, both who attend this session physically in Bali, including myself, and those who attend on Zoom, and those who attend on the live streaming platform, such as YouTube. So, before we begin with the session, thank you for attending the session. I will be reading the code of conduct in the meeting room. So, the first rule for this meeting is please make sure that your device, whether it's computer, laptop, mobile phone, have stable internet connection. Please use complete form in the format of name_stakeholders if you are joining via Zoom. You can choose the stakeholders categories which best describe you, whether it's government, civil society, private sector, academics, technical community, or others, as your account name to join the meeting room. The third rule, please turn off or mute your microphone during session for those who join us via Zoom. The fourth rule is participants are not expected to leave or join the meeting room. And participants are expected to turn the camera on and use a virtual backdrop that can be downloaded from the chat box. So you can find the virtual background on your chat box and invited to use it. And then the last rule is no spamming. The committee will have the rights to expel the participant from the meeting room, the virtual and the physical meeting room, if he or she is violating the rule and act inappropriate. For example, spamming, inappropriate picture, background, etc. So, with all the established rules being read and clear, I will proceed to the next session. Do you want to play the opening bumper? Okay. As the name of the session might suggest, this breakout session will invite prominent speakers from across the Southeast Asian region to talk about the development of cyber norms in Southeast Asia. Along with me, I've been joined by 4 fantastic speakers. The first speaker, I will introduce it to you, is Eugene Tan, Associate Research Fellow from the Center of Excellence for National Security, Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS. Eugene is specializing in cyberspace security issues, Singapore's foreign policy, and aviation issues. Eugene holds a Master's of International Studies and a postgraduate diploma in arts from the University of Otago, and a Bachelor of Arts from the National University of Singapore. You can follow him on Twitter at Eugene Tan. Hi, Eugene. Are you in the room?
Hello. Hi, guys.
And we have the second speaker from Malaysia, Falina Said, analyst in the Foreign Policy and Security Studies program of Institute of Strategic and International Studies under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Malaysia. Farlina was involved in crafting various dialogues and forums on cybersecurity, radicalization, and Malaysia-Korea relation. Her written work and comments have appeared in the local and international media, such as New Straits Times and South China Morning Post. She was a part of CRCCT experts in Violent Extremism and Community Engagement Council. Farlina graduated from RSIS with an MSc in Strategic Studies. Hi, Farlina.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hope this finds you well.
Yeah, Farlina extended her greetings to everybody in the room, and she will share case studies on norms implementation by taking specific issues in several countries in Southeast Asia. Next, we have my colleague from CSIS Indonesia, Fitri. Fitriani is a researcher at the Department of International Relations, CSIS Indonesia. Fitri research focus includes defense and security in Asia Pacific, women in peace and security, Indonesia politics and foreign policy, as well as non-traditional security. She specializes in women's participation in peacekeeping operation and the international dynamics on cybersecurity. Fitri obtained her PhD on Defense and Security Management from Cranfield University in the United Kingdom. Her Twitter is FitBinTim. Hi Fitri, how are you doing?
Hi, Belt. Thank you for having me here. I'm sorry that I have a longer hair because of the pandemic. No regular visit to the hairdresser, but I hope you accept me as I am. Very nice to see you all.
Thank you for having all of us. This is basically a very nice little reunion. So yes, Fitri will focus on how cyber norms can be a tool to address growing cyber threats in Southeast Asia and how human rights can be protected by cyber norms. And last but not least, we have Bart Hogeven. I hope I pronounced your name right. Head of Cyber Capacity Building at the International Cyber Policy Center with Australia's Strategic Policy Institute. Bart focuses on international peace and security, international aid and national security aspect of cyber affairs. Bart's also an active member of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, or the GFCE, the global platform for cyber capacity building. Before joining ASBI, Bart headed up the International Security and Cyber Policy Training Program at the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, Klingendel. Before that, Bart worked with the Dutch Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defense and was deployed as a civilian expert to the NATO and EU missions in Afghanistan. He can be found on Twitter at Bart Hogeven. Hi, Bart.
Hello, Belt. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Nice to see you. Bart will discuss and share the challenges for countries in implementing cyber norms and suggestions for policies and activities that can be done to address the challenges. Before we delve into the topic, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give you two short videos, as an illustration of what the topic of this workshop or this breakout session will be. We will introduce you to the 11 cyber norms and how it has transpired and how it has been a very interesting point of discussion in the region. Please.
To promote stability, the members of the United Nations have developed a framework that clearly articulates what states should and should not do in cyberspace. This framework for responsible state behaviour has 4 pillars. The first is that international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, applies to state conduct in cyberspace. Next are 11 agreed norms which set clear expectations of responsible state behaviour during peacetime. Those norms are supported by confidence-building measures which strengthen transparency, predictability and stability. The last pillar is cyber capacity building to ensure all states can harness the benefits and mitigate the risks of increased connectivity. All 193 UN member states have endorsed this framework, including in UN General Assembly Resolution 70237. Want more information? Visit un.org/disarmament/ICT-security. Norms are one component of the United Nations Framework for Responsible State Behaviour in Cyberspace. The framework's 11 peacetime norms that were adopted in 2015 set out 8 positive steps that states should take and 3 actions states should avoid. The 8 positive norms are: cooperating to increase stability and security in cyberspace, considering all relevant information in the case of cyber incidents, preventing criminal and terrorist use of information and communications technologies, respecting human rights, including privacy, online, taking appropriate measures to protect critical infrastructure from cyber threats, responding to reasonable requests for assistance from another state, taking steps to protect the integrity of supply chains for ICT products, and reporting ICT vulnerabilities in a responsible manner. The norms also list activities that states should refrain from. They are not knowingly allowing territory to be used to commit internationally wrongful acts using cyber tools, not conducting cyber activities that damage the critical infrastructure of another country, not harming another country's computer emergency response team or using a computer emergency response team to engage in malicious cyber activity. All 193 UN member states have endorsed these norms, including in UN General Assembly Resolution 70237. Want more information? Visit un.org/disarmament/ICT-security.
So, we have seen how the discussion in Southeast Asia Internet Governance Forum 2021 has unraveled for these past 2 days. We've discussed issues from the local level, from the national level, from the international level, and in this particular breakout session, we will be focusing on the issues of cyber norms in the region, as we have all seen in these past 2 days that ICTs basically is an increasingly important subject of political, economic, and social tensions. We've seen how ICTs have somehow substituted the physical presence, and is accelerated by the pandemic. We see an increasing numbers. As a consequence, we see an increasing numbers of cyber attacks on critical parts of the Southeast Asia economics. And mind you that Southeast Asia digital economics is a thriving one. Therefore, bigger chances, bigger potential for future attacks. We see the information environment polluted with divisive misinformation. Without an ability to impose consequences on malicious behavior, cyberspace seems to be caught in what is called as a tragedized trap, where strong power cross swords, but where the weaker actors suffers the most. While there are global efforts underway to prevent conflict in cyberspace, for instance, through the adoption of norms of responsible behavior in cyberspace, just like what we've seen in the video, this discussion are far removed from day-to-day practices in our region. Globally, the norms have been adopted through the UNGGE 2015 and within Southeast Asia at the 2018 ASEAN Ministerial Conference on Cybersecurity. ASEAN basically agreed to subscribe in principle to the 11 UN norms. So in this breakout, we'll be inviting experts from various regional think tanks, which will discuss ASEAN's progress in implementing and operationalizing such norms at the regional level and at the national level, by looking at how they have been at action and practiced by Southeast Asia internet communities. Before I let the first speakers, Eugene Tan, to begin presenting, I would like to remind the audience, online and offline, that you are invited for a Q&A session to throw your questions right from the very start. So, dear speakers, we will be collecting questions from probably 4 sources. The first is I will, once you all finish with your presentations, I will invite the attendees in the room, should they have questions that are to be directed to either one of you or in general. The second is I will invite the audience on Zoom and the live streaming on YouTube to write their questions, and should they have written their questions, I will read it aloud and give it to the floor to answer. The third source of question is I'm also allowing the possibilities for each speaker to question each other, because I believe that your presentations are 4 parts of the same bigger picture. And the fourth sources is I will abuse my right as a moderator to ask you a question. So with that said in mind, I believe that we can begin our session by the first speaker, Eugene Tan, who is currently joining us from Singapore. He will discuss ASEAN roles in shaping cyber norms, perhaps through the mechanism offered by the UNGGE and Open-Ended Working Group, and how it has socialized the norms locally. Eugene, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Belt. Wait, let me get my screen up. Okay, Belt, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eugene Tan, and I bring you greetings from the Center of Excellence for National Security at RSI's NTU, Singapore. I would like to express my deep regret of not being able to join you in person in Bali this week and enjoy a drink with Kusa after the conference. Before I start, I'd like to thank our host, the Indonesian Ministry of Information, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies for organizing this conference on internet governance in Southeast Asia. Like my fellow panelists, I believe that all states and stakeholders should be responsible actors in cyberspace and contribute to the furtherance of cyber norms debates both globally and regionally, and hasten its implementation to achieve a stable and secure cyberspace. ASEAN should therefore be part of this process as well. My remarks today will broadly focus on ASEAN's influence in shaping global cyber norms and how it hopes to socialize these norms locally. I hope to put forward a case that ASEAN is currently in a unique leadership position of being able to operationalize these norms despite being a collection of small and medium-sized states. I have divided my presentation today into three main sections. First, the state of play in ASEAN thus far. Second, how ASEAN has agreed to abide by the 11 norms agreed by the 2015 United Nations Group of Governmental Experts, or the UNGGE, despite its structural difficulties. And third, how ASEAN member states are pragmatic and will accept and abide by a universally agreed rules-based order. So point one, what has ASEAN done so far for the advancement of cyber norms? I'll classify these efforts into two main thrusts, cyber diplomacy and cyber capacity building. My remarks today will focus more on how ASEAN has invested in its diplomatic efforts to further cyber norms adoption, while my fellow panelists, Bart and Falina, will share more about the capacity building efforts that have been done in the region, as well as cover the challenges that ASEAN member states face in operationalizing these norms. So, there has been much work done on the diplomatic front to get ASEAN member states to agree on a way forward on cybersecurity. As noted before, ASEAN prides itself as the first regional organization that agreed in principle to be guided by the 2015 UNGGE norms as part of a rules-based international order. This agreement was made at a political level by all ASEAN leaders as early as 2018. The ASEAN leaders' statement on cybersecurity made at the 32nd ASEAN Summit in April 2018 signaled the political will of ASEAN leaders to tackle irresponsible behavior in cyberspace. This commitment was reaffirmed at the ASEAN Ministerial Conference on Cybersecurity, or AMCC, in November the same year. ASEAN leaders are also cognizant that norms and rule of law is needed for cyberspace and forms the basis for advancing economic growth in the region. At the first ASEAN Digital Ministers meeting held in January 2021, the ministers from ASEAN member states noted that enhancing cybersecurity cooperation is key to the security of ASEAN's future economy and digitalization initiatives, especially in view of the recent rise in global cybersecurity and supply chain attacks and threats. This is in line with ASEAN member states' collective commitment at the 2020 AMCC to take practical steps to enhance the cybersecurity of the region, in particular, the urgent need to protect national and cross-border critical infrastructure that serve as the backbone for regional communications trade, transportation, and logistic links. At the same time, a long-term regional cybersecurity action plan to implement the norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace was also agreed upon, taking into account the national priorities and cyber capacities of individual ASEAN member states. In other words, ASEAN is gradually moving from the political commitment to broad principles of the 2015 UNGG norms toward the finding of practical ways to operationalize these norms. So, I would further argue that ASEAN is actually ahead of and contributing to the global processes seeking responsible state behavior in cyberspace. The recently concluded round of UNGGE that took place between 2019 and 2021 has just released a consensus report and has provided more guidance on how states can implement the 2015 norms. ASEAN, on the other hand, is already incrementally moving forward on the operationalization of these norms. ASEAN participation at the UNGGE and the Parallel Open-Ended Working Group, or OEWG, has also been valued at the international level, with the 2019-2021 UNGGE round featuring 2 ASEAN members in Indonesia and Singapore being chosen as the chairman of the current OEWG from 2021 to 2025. With this set of circumstances, I believe that ASEAN has a unique leadership role in shaping how these norms are operationalized. Small and medium states, which is what ASEAN member states are typically norm takers instead of norm makers, because as small and medium-sized states, ASEAN member states do not have the ideational or material clout to influence the normative behavior of all states. But because ASEAN has quickly accepted the 2015 UNGG norms, provided timely input, and is constantly engaging other stakeholders on how the norms can be operationalized, ASEAN can cement its position as a global leader by providing a workable template for other regions to follow. My second point is more of a series of questions. How did ASEAN member states manage to agree to be guided by the UNGG norms? And why did ASEAN accept the 11 UNGG norms and not other norm initiatives? I put to you 2 points to consider why ASEAN member states adopted the 2015 UNGG norms faster than the other regions. First, the similarities between the 11 UNGG norms and the obligations enshrined in the ASEAN Charter, and second, these norms have been accepted by all states at the United Nations. So the first point, ASEAN member states have accepted in full the 11 norms because doing so does not add to their existing commitments to ASEAN instruments, such as the ASEAN Charter. For instance, the norm calling on states to not knowingly allow their territory to be used for internationally wrongful acts using ICTs can be mapped onto Article 2, subsection 2K of the ASEAN Charter, which calling on ASEAN member states to, and I quote, abstain from participation in any policy or activity, including the use of its territory, pursued by any ASEAN member state or non-ASEAN state, or any non-state actor which threatens the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political and economic stability of ASEAN member states, end quote. The norm on respecting human rights and privacy has also been similarly adopted because the ASEAN Charter and the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, documents that have been fundamentally agreed by all ASEAN member states, have provisions covering the protection of human rights in ASEAN. This aspect will be discussed at length by my fellow panelist, Fitriani, in a later presentation. So point two. ASEAN member states also attach great importance to the creation of an international rules-based order, which includes the formation and adherence to international law and norms. The adoption of and adherence to norms-based order is faster when ASEAN member states have had a hand in making these rules, like the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. As all states have accepted the recommendations of the 2015 UNGGE, there is a basis for ASEAN member states to accept and try to operationalize these norms. Conversely, there are prominent treaties that ASEAN have not ratified as a community because there is no universal acceptance. In this instance, each ASEAN member state has their own prerogative to subscribe to whatever initiatives or treaties based on their own national interests. For example, the Philippines has signed up to the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, but ASEAN as a regional grouping has not agreed to be guided by the convention. This piecemeal adoption can also be seen in other norm initiatives like the Paris Call. This also does not mean that ASEAN will not eventually adopt or sign up to these initiatives, but the process of garnering consensus from all ASEAN member states may take some time. This brings me to my final section, that ASEAN will choose on its own terms on how to advance norms discussion and implementation. This can be seen in how states in the region chose to advance discussion on both the UNGGE and OEWG tracks in 2018. As noted previously, ASEAN member states recognized the urgent need to address cybersecurity issues. Indonesia and Singapore, the two representatives to the 2019-2021 UNGGE, voted to advance both processes in spite of the different ideological differences behind the processes. Indonesia and Singapore were of the view that both processes were not incompatible to each other, and that both proposals had been amended in the negotiation process to embrace different views. So in closing, ASEAN has always followed its instinct of creating an internationally agreed rules-based order based on its own interests, which is consistent with other arenas where international law or rules are unsettled. ASEAN's practical operationalization of cyber norms may allow states to further the discussion on stability in cyberspace and form a basis of state practice. But the outcome of this operationalization is still uncertain, and it may lead to ASEAN member states concluding that a treaty approach to the governance of cyberspace is needed, because such an approach may create a stronger rules-based order that states can hold each other responsible. It is now up to the ASEAN member states to capitalize and not squander this unique opportunity to shape global governance in cyberspace. After all, ASEAN hopes to use digitalization as a means to recover from the economic impact of COVID-19, and having a set of well-established, well-operationalized, and commonly accepted norms for cyberspace gives the region a good foundation to build these aspirations upon. So, on this note, I thank you for your attention, and I will now pass the time to my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you for expounding the relationship of the 11 norms and ASEAN as a regional institutions, and how far along are we? And you mentioned strong and important points during your presentations, especially on how ASEAN has been committed to implementing the 11 norms politically, and now we are moving towards finding practical ways and to operationalize this norm. You also mentioned that the 11 norms are inherently compatible with ASEAN Charter and identity, so therefore such political and practical commitment should be implementable. And the last point that I would like to highlight is that you mentioned in your presentation that ASEAN seeks universal agreements of the implementation of those 11 norms from the international community, as well as seeking universal commitment from each of its member states to carry out in operationalizing such norms, which fits perfectly to the presentation from the next panelist, Farlina Said from ISIS Malaysia, because she will share The case studies on norms implementation and taking specific issues that happen in several countries in the region. Carolina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Balthazar, and also Eugene for building the foundation of this presentation. I believe that Bart would actually be able to share a lot more when it comes to the implementation of norms. So on the, I suppose, attempting to complement everybody's presentation, I will actually just be highlighting a very specific approach when it comes to protecting critical infrastructure and how ASEAN perhaps have actually developed approaches to actually protect critical infrastructure in this space. So I am going to now try and share my screen, which always becomes a task by itself. Hold on. Hold on. All right. I think you got it.
Yep,
okay.
Slides are visible.
All right, so let me just enter. All right, okay, so, oh no, I can't actually go back, never mind. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, I wish to thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies Indonesia, as well as the Southeast Asia Internet Governance Forum, for this opportunity to participate and contribute to a discussion on norms and responsible state behavior. Perhaps as we may have picked up throughout the forum and also from the previous speaker, that the role of government or the role of regional institutions is actually quite important when it comes to driving certain changes, particularly to create safer cyber practices and transparent state behavior. So in this topic, which unfortunately I have actually just turned the slide, so on this topic, we will actually learn what does it mean when we are referring to responsible state behavior, the unique position of critical infrastructure in this space, because what it means for the government as well as what it means for government duties, what is critical infrastructure, as well as what ASEAN is actually doing when it comes to the implementation of norms and protecting critical infrastructure. So what does it mean when we refer to responsible state behavior and norms? Perhaps as indicated by the previous speaker, at one point it seems as if there was an ambiguity as to how international law actually applies to cyberspace. And in a domain that is populated by government, security sectors, and the general public, as well as the increasing efforts of digitalization, the nature of cyberspace that is opaque means that certain rules and behaviors needs to be understood. So I'm actually stretching this conversation a little back because how states actually came to identify critical infrastructure, well, today is actually a given normative that there are certain infrastructures that's actually deemed as essential. Sometime back, it's actually not so common. As a matter of fact, it's actually a concept that might actually be popularized perhaps in the last 20 years. So if we were to actually take a look at this, and this is actually going to be divided into 3 slides, somewhere between beginning 1967, ending at 2021. So we begin with 1967, where we actually have ARPANET, born from the need to actually produce communication systems that could survive bombardments, where later comes the interconnected testing of the ARPANET, PRNet, and SETNet, which are the foundations of what we actually know as the internet, because they actually adopted the protocols that would allow the switching of technology. So in 1981, ARPANET was separated between the military and civilian networks. The history of the internet, as we actually would all know, it actually started because of the need to develop communications that would actually survive any types of issues, inclusive of bombardments and things like that. Moving on really quickly, in 1994, the internet service is actually taken over by commercial companies known as internet service providers, and in 1995 is the commercialization boom that we actually know today. So just to actually bring a little bit of a security perspective in this same time period, we actually have the Gulf War, which is where the War of the Information Age began on intelligence gathering. That will be, if we were to actually look at military doctrines, that's the US 1996 Field Manual 100-6, developed on the concept of information operations, where actions taken to achieve information superiority by affecting adversary information-based processes, information systems, and computer-based networks, while defending one's own information-based processes, information systems, and computer-based networks, are actually regarded as something that is important for military doctrine. This field manual also states the different types of activities that can actually be taken by the military. So perhaps it may not be a surprise that because of the development of military doctrines into things like information superiority, you actually do get something like the draft resolution placed in United Nations, draft resolution 53-53/70, which was first introduced by the Russian Federation to the United Nations as a matter of international security. In 1998, the Russian Federation introduced this draft where it actually stated it recognized that scientific and technological developments could have both civilian and military applications. It asked for basic notions related to information security or misuse of information and telecommunication systems and information sources. So why is this period important? Because for most nations, this digitization would have been seen as an IT matter. In places like Malaysia, for instance, conversations on IT and security in this period was mainly a computer or system-based concern and was parked in a ministry like Ministry of Science and Technology. So the introduction of information security as an international security issue means that different government agencies will actually have to look into the matter that would describe it as a national security issue. So further to this, we actually have the attack on the World Trade Center, which was significant to articulate the concept of critical infrastructure. 9/11, following the 9/11 attack came the concept of critical infrastructure that was articulated in policies that aim to harden security and legal measures, such as the US Patriot Act of 2001 and EU's Directive 2008/114/EC, which spoke about the procedures to protect the critical infrastructure sectors and services. This is further adopted by the UN General Assembly Resolution 58/199 on the creation of a global culture of cybersecurity and the protection of critical information infrastructures in 2003. So from here, we can actually see that this discussion moves from responsible state behaviors, looks at what government needs to do to protect critical systems, particularly for a cyberspace that actually seems borderless. The establishment of the first UNGGE on developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security was a year after the discovery of hackers in US Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake. The first UNGGE examined the impact of developments in ICT on national security and military affairs. The focus was either on content or on information infrastructure, and because of these divergence, there was actually no consensus. The second UNGGE, held between 2009 and 2010, fared better with a consensus report that articulates the dialogue on norms for states' use of ICTs to reduce risk and protect critical infrastructure. So the protection of critical infrastructure is encouraged with confidence building and risk reduction measures also discussed. This would also include discussions on ICTs in conflict, information exchanges on national legislation and ICT security strategies. The third UNGGE highlighted state sovereignty and due to the mention of the UN Charter included its principles on non-intervention and the use of force applies in cyberspace. So the norm on not attacking critical infrastructure would include cyber-specific applications. The 2000s actually had significant cyber attacks. As we note, and as we would actually note, the attack on Estonia services in 2007 and the discovery of Stuxnet in 2008. It is also in this age where the US elections was actually seen as an election that was primarily internet influenced. The increase in digitization and its usage widens the usage of cyberspace, but for states, it also begs the question of state roles and responsibilities to protect critical infrastructure. And perhaps this is the era that we would actually all be most familiar with when it comes to norm development. The 2015 UNGGE that was particularly significant to highlight responsible state behaviors, as attacks on critical infrastructure is deemed the most harmful. Attacks on critical infrastructure and associated informations of a state is regarded as both real and serious. In the 2021 UNGGE report, it was stated that it's the state's prerogative to identify their critical infrastructure, as it has always been stated since 2003, with the recognition that the infrastructure may be owned, managed, and operated by the private sector, while the OEWG recommended that states continue to strengthen measures to protect all critical infrastructures from ICT threats and increase exchanges on best practices with regard to critical infrastructure protection. So if we were to actually look at everything from 1967 to 2021, the conversations actually do beg us to ask the question, what can be actually considered as critical infrastructure? What should states do to protect critical infrastructure? And are there thresholds of harm when we are actually speaking of critical infrastructure? So we're actually going to just to highlight a few interesting things about the unique position of critical infrastructure protection and state policy. Because all states have certain services that are deemed critical, it gives grounds of understanding where cyber hygiene practices need to be high. These would identify the resources direction that states would actually adopt. It also allows states to become familiar with an environment that is multi-stakeholder. In some countries, the critical infrastructure is wholly owned and managed by the private sector, with laws in place for government oversight. But cybersecurity, as we learn, it can be a supply chain situation. It is about oversight for procurement, cybersecurity procedures, and information sharing, because the weakest link will be the vulnerability that can impact the security of your systems. Because critical infrastructure are the essential services and deemed the lifeline of a nation, identifying critical infrastructure gives nations a sense of priority for cyber, particularly when digitization is occurring in a rapid pace. While we would think that every nation would have the same idea of critical infrastructure, this is not necessarily true because the considerations of vulnerabilities are different. For instance, we don't really have a Panama Canal here that would actually impact our own critical infrastructure consideration. As I've actually mentioned, I think, some of these parts, which is actually the concept of critical infrastructure following the 9/11 attacks. And then also, I think there are the concept of critical infrastructure would actually shift through time. And I think for some governments, if we actually notice some COVID-19, for instance, would have actually impacted what is actually regarded as critical infrastructure. I think in the 2021 UNGGE report, it was actually highly recommended for the healthcare to actually also be included in the critical infrastructure if it's actually not included prior. So the concept of critical infrastructure was adopted in the UN General Assembly Resolution 58/199 on the creation of a global culture of cybersecurity and the protection of critical information infrastructures. This actually specifically states that the increasing links among most countries' critical infrastructures, such as those used for the transmission and distribution of energy, air and maritime transport, banking and financial services, e-commerce, water supply, food distribution and public health, and the critical information infrastructures that increasingly interconnect and affect their operations make it necessary to actually develop the global culture of cybersecurity. So among the statements in the UNGA 58/199 is the identification and then identification on threats towards these critical infrastructure, the development of law, regulation and strategies to protect the critical infrastructures are also encouraged. For cyber, the term critical information infrastructure was popularized during this era of the 2000s when there was a need to identify and coordinate information technology and operational technology protection efforts. So I suppose this will be a slide that we would all actually be waiting for, perhaps a comparison of what some nations would actually regard, particularly when we're actually looking at ASEAN, when we speak about critical information infrastructure and if there's actually a commonality in this space. This is actually work that was done by ASEAN as well as Thailand's Electronic Transactions Development Authority, where they have looked at the different nations in ASEAN to identify, see whether there are articulations of similar critical infrastructures. And the most common sectors are the government agency, energy and utilities, banking and financial services, SICTs. The members do deviate in areas such as transportation, defense and security services, as well as business process outsourcing, as we would actually notice. Because these are actually, the research was actually conducted via survey, if I'm not actually mistaken, and interviews Cambodia and Laos during the time which has not actually declared their critical infrastructure, but they have actually identified these as priorities. Okay, so let's talk a little about ASEAN and the implementation of norms in protecting critical infrastructure. Why is it important, particularly for conversational norms and responsible state behavior, when we are actually looking at critical infrastructure in ASEAN? For one thing, for a state, it actually identifies a state responsibility because cyberspace is interconnected. It actually outlines the resources that should be directed for states to uphold their due diligence. It also tells you which agencies would actually be relevant for international collaborations as international relations progress. Critical infrastructures could actually determine the severity of a response. If we are to take ASEAN as an example for upholding norms or responsible state behavior, then the adoption to implement the 11 UN norms would be a great starting point. So here we can actually see that there are the norms that explicitly talks about what the state should or should not do for critical infrastructure as adopted by ASEAN. Among these, we would actually notice the blue sections that actually said states should not support or conduct cyber attacks that damage critical infrastructure. States should cooperate and respond to requests for assistance related to protecting their critical infrastructure. States should protect their critical infrastructure. Specifically mentioned in the report, a state should not conduct or knowingly support ICT activity contrary to its obligations under international law that intentionally damages critical infrastructure or otherwise impairs the use and operation of critical infrastructure to provide services to the public. States should take appropriate measures to protect their critical infrastructure from ICT threats, taking into account General Assembly Resolution 58/199 on the creation of a global culture of cybersecurity. States should respond to appropriate requests for assistance by another state whose critical infrastructure is subject to malicious ICT acts. States should seek to facilitate cross-border cooperation to address critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. And in this environment, it would actually, while the blue would actually highlight the specific critical infrastructure, would highlight specifically the limiting as well as positive duties of the states when it comes to critical infrastructure. It is actually the gray that would build the cybersecurity ecosystems that is needed to ensure that critical infrastructure is actually protected, and these would actually be inclusive of things like practices towards the computer emergency response teams, collaborations with the computer emergency response teams, the need to actually improve information sharing and the state's awareness of their own ICT vulnerabilities. So when we are looking for ASEAN's performance for the implementation of norms specific to critical infrastructure, what exactly would we be looking for? And among these would be the identification of critical infrastructure, cybersecurity law that targets misuse, military doctrines that guide military behaviors in cyberspace, government bodies or sectoral leads for critical infrastructure sectors, government procedures that highlights cooperation and collaborative mechanisms to protect critical infrastructure. And for international collaborations and dependency of critical infrastructure will be the transparency mechanisms needed for information sharing in the case of incident responses, point of contact for sectors. So these are actually all underpinned by capacity building efforts. And we actually have to think about the role of ASEAN when we actually do think about their space for movement and their ability to actually build protection of critical infrastructure efforts. ASEAN is a body whose strength is to coordinate and serve as a platform for cooperation, could build their roles in facilitating capacity building, for instance, with dialogue partners, serving as a dialogue platform to discuss domestic rules and regulations, such as those that will govern critical infrastructure. They can harmonize efforts, particularly when it comes to any types of shared infrastructure, build platforms for information sharing and trust building. This is especially important if there is a cyber incident traced to an ASEAN member state and a request for more information is seen as suspicious. It would actually be problematic if the sectors actually do not share the information. So in the earlier framework project by ASEAN and Thailand's ETDA, it was stated that in their interview sectors deemed as most sensitive to information sharing are first, the defense and security sector, second, the financial services, third, government, agency and ministry. Meanwhile, most feasible sectors for information sharing are media and public communications, food and agriculture, transportation. Information sharing practices would impact building safer cyberspaces, as information sharing is necessary to discover vulnerability or to a certain context with cyber incidences. So where might ASEAN be when it comes to building responsible state behavior and protecting critical infrastructure? So here, I do apologize, it's actually a little bit small. For ASEAN, as mentioned by Eugene earlier, they have actually adopted the 11 norms, which is to steer domestic development and build regional regulatory environments to ensure that interconnected systems are not vulnerable. The support for the norms have encouraged coordination efforts, and among them is to coordinate within ASEAN. So ASEAN has conducted efforts in this space, and for many years, the approaches to cybersecurity in ASEAN are divided across various working groups and bodies, such as the ASEAN Political Security Community, the Economic Community, and the Socio-Cultural Community pillars. Most conversations on cybersecurity stem from the ASEAN Telecommunications and IT Ministers meeting that has various working groups on regulators and other ICT matters. In 2019, the idea of an ASEAN cross-sectoral coordinating committee was promoted with the inaugural meeting held in 2020. Perhaps this would be timely as the ASEAN communities do promote initiatives that will concern cybersecurity that affecting all the sectors, such as the ASEAN data governance framework that was mentioned earlier, or even standards and agreements like the ASEAN model contractual agreement. The ASEAN Regional Action Plan matrix on the United Nations group of governmental experts that was announced late last year seeks to collect ASEAN activities that will correspond with supported norms, with an articulation of the overall objective as how this actually matches with ASEAN initiative. One aspect of the implementation of the norms is context and interpretation, because there are initiatives already existing but it may not be articulated as those corresponding to the norms. So this matrix that's actually being conducted now would actually aim to scale up best practices, encourage exchanges, to actually also ask ASEAN member states to actually look at the type of practices that is actually already found in their spaces, because there would actually be some of the best practices, and to coordinate where possible and move the vehicle for the implementation of the UN norms forward. So other aspects, the other types of ASEAN cooperation that's actually found in this space are the ASEAN Declaration to Prevent and Combat Cybercrime, even ASEAN +1 statements that actually do highlight cybersecurity cooperation. ASEAN-Japan efforts in this space is actually particularly significant to actually raise capacity building efforts, as it actually looks at drills, dialogue series, cybersecurity policy handbooks. There are also joint operations with Interpol, and then also ASEAN drills, which is the asset that's actually conducted. The confidence building measures, there are actually also confidence building measures in this space, which actually looks at information sharing that could actually increase when it comes to ASEAN practices. Among them is the ASEAN Cyber Defense Network that was actually just announced. Hello? I do apologize.
Hi, Falina. I can hear your voice clearly. I can still hear your voice.
All right. I will end this soon. Do not worry. this is my last slide, so I will just actually rush through everything. I think when we're actually looking at the role of ASEAN when it comes to how we can actually build stability in cybersecurity process, we are actually thinking about confidence building measures, and we are actually thinking about it in terms of like the information sharing that can actually be conducted, for that to actually be for it to stabilize preventive diplomacy efforts to a certain extent, and this can actually be through the initiation of a point of contact, as was actually done in the ASEAN Regional Forum in 2018. The ASEAN Regional Forum is actually also a forum that that actually looked at the sharing of information on national laws, policies, best practices, and strategies, as well as rules and regulations. ASEAN is also involved in incident responses, like the ASEAN Cybersecurity Cooperation Strategy, and the ASEAN Cyber Defense Network that actually does aim to I think this was actually addressed earlier. Sorry, I think I misplaced this one. So there are actually capacity building efforts. That's the ASEAN-Japan Cybersecurity Capacity Building Center, as well as the ASEAN-Singapore Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. Other initiatives that would actually look at how ASEAN is actually encouraging for there to be greater movement when it comes to development of rules and regulations or laws can actually be traced back to even the ARS statement on cooperation in fighting cyber attack and terrorist misuse of cyberspace in 2006, or the ASEAN Telecommunications and IT Ministers meeting, where each member state should actually set up their own cert. But developments for the domestic developments are susceptible to domestic priorities. And in that sense, if there is no pressure for there to actually digitize, or there is actually no pressure for there to actually be development, or for the development of rules and regulation, it may actually lose the appetite to actually to create the rules and regulations actually needed. Thus, the ASEAN vehicles, the implementation of the regional action plan matrix, as well as the adoption of the 11 norms, is actually helpful to drive the processes forward. So this, I think this is my last, yes. So just to conclude, the identification of critical infrastructure is crucial for states to actually familiarize with the cyber environment and build cyber regulatory system. The role of ASEAN is actually useful to coordinate efforts and the implementation of norms and facilitate best practice exchanges. But the endeavors in ASEAN are susceptible to domestic priorities and development of policies. So I stop my presentation here. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And I do look forward to your question.
Thank you, Felina. Once again, I'm inviting the attendees, both who attend this session online and offline. If you want to ask questions, especially to the online audience, you can start typing your questions on the chat box or through YouTube live comment. And thanks, Felina, for your stories and for highlighting the unique position of the critical infrastructure. You've made an argument that critical infrastructure can indeed be an entry point for states to prioritize cyber issues, but at the same time, it may add yet another diverging priorities to an already diverse region, and adds to a more challenging topography of cyber maturity and preparedness in the region. But if I would have to say so myself, if I can take my own conclusion from what you said, it's at the very least critical infrastructure underlines the multidimensionality and multi-stakeholderism nature of the cyber norms of responsible state behavior, and therefore the engagement of the high political leads to the technical communities is yet again important. And as for the multidimensionality of the issues, I would say that critical infrastructure highlights that this is not only a technical matter, but also political decisions, but and many others. In relations to that, I think it will fit perfectly to what Fitri will have to say for the next presentations, because as two of the previous speakers have expounded to us all, that there has been already plethora of initiatives and mechanisms in ASEAN to implement the norms and to carry forward the norms. And maybe Fitri, you can tell us more about how the norms of the responsible state behavior can be used not only to protect the critical infrastructure, but also the human rights dimension of it, and also to protect us from the incoming cyber threats. So I will give the floor to you.
Thank you, Belts, for your opening. Sorry for sharing screen so fast, but I will try to make my presentation fast, because as much as I love to talk about norms, not everybody here are that keen of discussing norms. And I would like to share more on the human rights side. And I will echo Eugene's presentation on the issue of human rights in ASEAN, adaptation or acceptance of global norms. The adaptation of the human right in the cyberspace is, I agree with Eugene, following the ASEAN interest. And that said, the operationalization of norms on human rights depends greatly on the Asian member state understanding, acceptance, and usage of human rights. That I will show in my last slide on how each of the 10 ASEAN countries enacts its own law regarding the protection of human rights, which is limiting perhaps, as I echo Farlina's presentation in the table of the norms, of the 11 norms. How can norms of human rights be a limiting norms instead of positive duties of states? And because I think the countries in Southeast Asia would sense human rights as categorizing as an issue need to be prevented and addressed, and seeing therefore the human rights violation as categorized as the cybercrime, and it is approached by the cybercrime perspective. That's why I quote most of my data from the Interpol, the ASEAN Interpol data, and see how that would address the issue of the leaking of privacy data in the region. So I will share my presentation with the ASEAN current and emerging cybersecurity threat, which with a 66% of internet access in Southeast Asia region is relatively high if we compare with Latin America or Africa. And with its growing rapidly over the past few years, the COVID pandemic has led government and businesses to speed up its digital transformation. And with more digital access, of course, there's more digital threat. And we see a lot of data breach ransomware happening in the region as of late. And as the data from the Interpol last year, it listed 6 highest cyber threat to the region. Which number 1 is a business email compromise. If any of you have received, fraudulent transfer, try to target companies, or even phishing, trying to accept copies identity through fake website for gaining financial information by scammers, and ransomware that we use to access the data being blocked, and we need to pay some fee. The e-commerce data interception, we know the case of Tokopedia, at least nationally in Indonesia. The new emerging trend as well is crimeware as a service, whereby this is increasingly trendy in countries where you can hire hacker to do illegal activity online for you. And the last, which is a common threat, that is fraud, that is much more enabled by the technology. And we see how this trend translate in the region, as it target companies with big brand, and also interestingly ASEAN banks. The reason is because the banks in ASEAN is using technology without having sufficient capability to securing the data of its user. And that said as well, the low understanding of privacy data as something that needs to be protected in the region is something that makes it the information that a bank client is quietly available if you are once given people trying to offer you credit card or financial loan online. And what is interesting as well is that ransomware or attacks is originating from one of the biggest countries in ASEAN. And I think this is something that we need to be aware of and need to work together in terms of understanding that Although all the countries trying to access the internet and the cyberspace, not all countries have the capability, awareness, and literacy in using and securing the usage of it. So we might want to have benefit, but we might not know how we can benefit it fully, and having that utilization also positive and not get trapped and losing our freedom there. So I would focus on the cyber threats and human rights, and how personal information are often the target of cybercrime, as cybercrime undermines rights, including the right of privacy, freedom of expression, and non-discrimination, which can affect people's livelihood. The issue of right to privacy allows people to keep information about themselves out of the hand of those they don't want to have the information, and sometimes this, especially in a government data, that countries in the region are trying to go digital without actually securing their citizen data. This can have, a prone of having those data leaked. Also, the issue of blackmail by phishing attacks that restrict people's freedom of expression, and especially with the COVID now, to what extent is people's freedom of expression, and to what extent it is actually endanger public health, as well as a lot of online scam and the use of malware. And focusing on the 11 norms of that is accepted on the UNGGE 2015 that read the norms number 5, respect of human right and privacy. That reads, states ensuring the secure use of ITC should respect Human Rights Council resolution on the promotion, protection, and enjoyment of human rights on the internet, as well as General Assembly resolution to the right to privacy in the digital age, to guarantee full respect of human rights, including the right to freedom of expression. And also this said that the internet is not a Wild Wild West because it respects the international law and the UN Charter as applicable, where state sovereignty applies to state conduct and there's jurisdiction over ICT infrastructure within their territory. And they have obligation, the state have obligation to respect human rights and fundamental freedom and meet international obligation regarding internationally wrongful act and attributed to them. And the UNGGE report adopted recently in the mid-2021 has the breakthrough of acknowledged international humanitarian law applies to cybercrime operation, especially during armed conflict. This is somehow cause an optimism, although ASEAN country hasn't actually discuss and how the international humanitarian law will apply and actually define what's the attack in the cybercrime cyber context and whether data leak is an object. But I think it is a good progress to have that at least in the time of cyber attack that for example, what Farlina said about critical information, the hospital, the doctor should be protected. This is what the regional ASEAN have done in terms of having ASEAN cybercrime operation desk with the purpose to address the growing cyber threat in the region, enhancing cybercrime intelligence with the knowledge exchange workshop, assessment, as well as having a support for investigative and operational supports, knowing that not all Asian country has the capacity to address cyber crime. And having the regional effort using joint operation through the 4 steps of collect and analyze, prioritize and strategize, operationalize and evaluate. The ASEAN Regional Forum, that's why the wider region, not only Southeast Asia, but also big powers that is in the region, also joining to help the cyber security capacity building. That is exactly why, for example, BART is here as part of Australia to support the security cooperation and the use of ICT. And that it has decided, the RFI has decided to have a cooperation to support a secure, resilient, and sustainable digital infrastructure to promote, as appropriate, the synergy between relevant national initiative and the master plan of ASEAN Connectivity 2025. That would promote inclusive development of digital literacy and bridge digital divide and development gap. And lastly, ensuring protection of personal and of consumer data and privacy. And with actions such as ASEAN Regional Confidence Building Measure, with cyber capacity program that have been done since 2012, and it's ongoing every year. So this is my last two slides, which I mentioned earlier about how different the ASEAN member state have in its way of protection, in conducting protection of human rights through securing national data and privacy law. So because of the development in the cyber and digital space very fast, countries are actually struggling to create and issue regulation. And therefore, I can say that these regulations are still evolving and not always perfect, because there's always ways of violating rights in the cyberspace, and also cybercrime that is happening. But I think countries have made its way. For example, Singapore has the Personal Data Protection Act 2012 that can be said as one of the best in the region. And Malaysia as well have the Personal Data Protection Act 2010 that Indonesia is still trying to grappling to issue, because in Indonesia the government and the legislative actually working quite how do I say meticulous in issuing regulations. So we're still working on it. Philippines also have the Data Privacy Act, and the issue with this Data Protection Acts and Information Acts is to which extent it protects, or to which extent it will actually hamper the freedom of expression. So what actually could be dangerous or could be concerning for activists or journalists or people that state their opinion online. Because, for example, the Indonesian Information Electronic Transaction law is known as that law that can be quite tricky for activists. So to close, what's ASEAN ability to promote human rights in the digital era? What is already we see first is data protection focused confidence building measures and capacity building measures has been done, and it has been done in a coordinated manner as reflected in UNGGE's 11 cyber norms. Government are trying to handle its cybersecurity information sharing activities, but still, they still have legal and policy barriers as well as capacity barrier. And I think it would be beneficial to advance the work of security researchers by creating a framework that addresses intent or clarify acceptance of behavior in cyberspace, and how we can put forward confident and capacity building measures in the region, especially addressing digital divide. Second, pushing ASEAN countries to have legal framework on data protection. I don't know whether we can address what Eugene was asking, whether ASEAN can have a treaty. ASEAN has a human rights declaration, but I don't know whether that could be also reflected online as well. The ASEAN Intergovernment Commission on Human Rights, ACHR, still trying to grasp how the implementation of protection and promotion of human rights in the cyberspace in ASEAN. I think for ASEAN countries, the protection of human rights and promotion of human rights still fall into the government to protect their citizens in the digital realm. And we see there's countries that are problematic because they are member states that are having, that is having concern or conflict within their own border. I would not mention the name of the country. Last but not least is the coordination between private sector, mostly e-commerce business that we see having their data leaks, civil society as a watchdog, and tech sector and data protection measures. As this cooperation has been supported by the Digital Geneva Convention and have the states to control cyber usage to an extent, perhaps cyber weapons. And also with the tech company and private sector to have a form of security by design would prevent attackers and loophole in the system and help victims reduce their vulnerabilities. I guess that's all for me. Sorry for my bad English, but I hope I can convey my notes clearly. Thank you so much. I return to the moderator.
Thank you, Fitri. There is already a lot of fantastic questions coming to Zoom. Keep them coming, as Bart would say. I also invite the speakers to start thinking of the questions that are directly addressed to them. And maybe if you have questions that you would prefer to answer the next Q&A session, just please let me know. And again, I invite the attendees from online and both online and offline to ask the questions on YouTube, live chat, and in Zoom. So, Fitri, you mentioned how there are already challenges that may serve as an hindrance or maybe opportunities to implement the norms. You've expounded the growing and the rising cyber threat in the region. You mentioned how different, how the diverging topography of cyber maturity in the region in the form of data governance and regulations, where some countries may have more robust data governance than the others. So, apart from these challenges, I believe that this fits well to the next presenter and the last but not least speaker. But apart from these challenges, if you have any stories from the region about these challenges and how do we implement the norms? How do we get from political endorsement to putting into practice? What are the required steps for the norms to be, let's just say, powerful enough to overcome the challenges? I'm giving the floor to you.
Great, thanks, Belts. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear, both online as well as in person in Bali. Similar to Eugene, I'm sorry I can't be there, but hopefully at the next IGF we will all be able to meet in person. And thanks also to Kemko Kominfo and the Indonesia IGF for organizing this great event, and for CSCS and Dr. Fitriani in particular for initiating this session. It's been really fantastic to hear the previous speakers, and I'll try to maybe square the circle a little bit, because we heard obviously Dr. Fitriani talk about some of the kind of the common cybersecurity challenges across the region, and I think no country is escaped from that. and also the wider implications for not just for security, but also for human rights and for your own safety online. And we heard Falina talk about the importance of critical infrastructure and protecting critical infrastructure, in particular in this age of increased connectivity, where lots of our critical infrastructure is dependent on connectivity and being accessible online. And I would really like to just maybe focus really quickly, because I think there were great questions, so indeed keep them coming, and I'll be short and sweet, hopefully. And I will really try to focus on what does implementation of the norms mean, because I think that squares the circle with the opening presentation by Eugene. What I would like to say first, just as kind of my opening statement, don't worry about or forget about capacity building and forget about UN norms when you think about it. Because it's not about implementing a set of 11 or more norms that were agreed back in 2015 and which were re-agreed or reaffirmed earlier this year. It's about what you as a country, as a government, as a cybersecurity community are doing locally, nationally, why you're doing it, and to explain what is working well in your very own local context. And I think that's still oftentimes what I believe is a mistake in looking at these UN norms and the UN agreements, is that it's being seen as kind of a very abstract blueprint which individual countries have to conform. Whereas in essence, it's rather the other way around, where the existing UN norms that were explained in the video clips earlier and which Eugene touched upon are really based on what's happening already, what makes common sense across the globe, and what does the general international community considers as good practice and as kind of the basic minimum what we all could expect from each and every country in the world, including the states in Southeast Asia, including the country that I'm residing in Australia. And there are a couple of things how you can go about it as a nation. Is one of the things is to develop some kind of national roadmap or an action plan. And that's why in many countries, and I think Indonesia is kind of the rare exception at the moment, where there is some kind of national cybersecurity strategy or policy. And it's not so much the policy or the strategy itself, it's the process that's leading to that policy, which makes everyone aware of what is working, where are our strengths, where are our weaknesses, what do we require additionally, whether that's in support from others, within the economy, within the nation, or from outside. And that's what kind of you would call where is our demand, where is our requirement to receive capacity building. But it also works the other way around. Because we all have our unique experiences, our unique expertise, our unique skill sets. The cybersecurity skills and expertise from Australia are, I believe, only partly relevant for nations in Southeast Asia, because the economy, the governance, the way you go about using digital tools is different from how it's been done here, or let alone elsewhere in the world. In fact, there are quite a couple of things that others could learn from and would benefit from expertise and skills in the region. So capacity building, not just in terms of receiving it, but also in terms of offering it to others. And sorry,
before us.
I've got my Zoom screen on my last bullet, so there it is. And so I think that's kind of the first thing, is you first need to understand yourself where you're at in terms of cybersecurity, what you require, where are your weaknesses and where are your strengths. But then it's equally important, and that's where the UN norms really come in, is to make sure that other countries, other regional organizations, that's where ASEAN comes in, are aware of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what you're expecting of other countries and other regional organizations. So when we talk about the UN norms, we can easily focus on what's written there, but it's really about the expectations that we have from these international agreements.
Before a state can actually...
Sorry, I will skip this one because of the time, and I'm much more interested in questions. So when we look at implementation of the norms, I think we should not only look at the great and bold, and indeed, as Eugene mentioned, unique statements made by the ASEAN Ministerial Conference and the ASEAN leaders from 2018 onwards, because you're right, ASEAN was and is the first regional organization that subscribed and endorsed the UN norms. It is an important part, but it's not the only part. So we could look at kind of voting records in the UN, various ASEAN statements or statements by several ministries. One great example is that I think late last year, the Minister for Public Security in Vietnam made a very public statement saying that Vietnam is fully behind the broader framework for responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and is doing its best to fulfill all the expectations that drive from it. And other senior ministers and heads of state have made similar statements. Secondly, it's about probably the integration and internalization of the meaning of some of these norms. So can we see the gist and the idea, the spirit of the UN norms back in new legislation, in the legal framework? Can we see them back in a national cybersecurity strategy, or can we see them back in several national policies? And that's still a very long-term process and a bit of a paperwork process. But where it really becomes interesting, I think, is can we see it back in practice? The funny thing is, I think that ASEAN and the ASEAN countries, member states, have made a point in international debates about we object to the militarization of cyberspace, which is a very fair position and a fair point. But at the same time, we see that, I think with no exception, all militaries in ASEAN have their own cyber units and cyber capabilities, or are currently looking at developing them. And that's, from an international security or from a UN norms perspective, not at all an issue. The issue is, how do you use them in a responsible manner? And are you open and transparent about what kind of capabilities you have, without disclosing secrecies or operational details? But first of all, do you acknowledge that you have capabilities and that you may be using them? But then secondly, do you have doctrine and procedures in place that makes me certain and reassures me that you are using them in a proper manner? For instance, distinguishing between a critical infrastructure and less critical infrastructure, or between civilian targets or non-civilian targets, and between criminals and maybe general citizens who should be left unaffected. And finally, what kind of actions does a country take to attest and to demonstrate that it is acting according to these norms? This could be, again, let's say in the form of public statements or attending certain meetings, and being part of negotiation processes, like Eugene mentioned at the very start. It could also be, does my National Police Service manage to take offline malicious websites or botnets? As Dr. Citriani mentioned in her presentation, some of the Interpol coordinated interventions in Southeast Asia. I think for any one of you who's working in this space, this is nothing like a surprise, and you will probably all respond to this. I think that's what we're doing already. What's so special about this? And I think if that is your response, I think you're right. There's nothing special about this. It's about kind of recording and documenting that you're doing this, that this is being done consciously and deliberately, and that it's being shared more broadly outside of our own national borders, within the region, and hopefully even internationally. Because if you look at the UN norms, it doesn't tell you what to do or how to do things. It just expresses a couple of expectations. And to me, those expectations are that you as a country are able to engage in international cooperation, not just at the level of foreign ministries, but also at the operational level, so police to police cooperation, CERT to CERT cooperation, Ministry of Communications to Ministry of Communications cooperation, and even at the very kind of at the level of tactical teams. Secondly, there is an expectation that you as a government are able to formulate policies and decisions representing all areas of government. So it's not national security dominated or infrastructure and communications dominated, but there is a real, just a single whole of government conscious decision about policies and policy decisions. For instance, in the situation of a major incident, that, for instance, the Ministry of Defense is not jumping to conclusions and start doing all kinds of reprisal actions, but that there is a conscious process in place where the different pluses and minuses and broader context of a situation is taken into account. It's also an expectation of recognizing that states are developing their own cyber capabilities. That could be within the military, within the police, within the intelligence, within the CERT communities, that any of those capabilities are used responsibly and professionally. And finally, and I think that's where you see lots of international tension, and I think that's where ASEAN is in a bit of a particular situation because of its non-interference principles, but also I think of its implicit practice of never ever calling out another state for its wrongdoings. But the norms, as we agreed them here, are so far the only way in which members of the international community can take responsibility for certain acts, and whereby others can hold them to account, or where you can be held accountable yourself. And finally, I think it's important to recognize that there is no expectation that, for instance, a country like Myanmar will have the same cyber maturity levels as a country like Singapore. That will be absurd. So really, also when we look at implementation, it's all about adopting it commensurate, so in line with national levels of cyber maturity. And this is probably the biggest implementation challenge. Is not that we're not doing this. It's a challenge in reporting what we're doing and making sure that our senior policymakers, and I think in most countries that relates to the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, are aware of what's happening in our domestic agencies and in kind of the broader internet governance community, and being able to articulate that with partners in ASEAN and with partners in different UN bodies that Eugene mentioned at the very start of this conversation. And it's also important, and I think that was a point that Eugene raised as well, is that so far the conversations have been, I mean, ASEAN states have been increasingly participating in these debates, but relatively recently. So most of the debates, I think in all honesty, have been based on developments in Western, highly sophisticated, cyber-capable nations. But it's really about making others aware and also making yourself comfortable that you are also kind of conforming to the UN norms and you're implementing them based on local context, based on own national or local priority. And each and every country's and economy's own threat environment and risk analysis. And the risk environment for a country like Indonesia is fundamentally different than a risk analysis for a country like Australia. And I think that needs to be recognized as well. And that's why it's important that all nations in the world have an informed position about all of this. And that's probably the whole point about capacity building around norms. So there is kind of capacity building around how do you go about norms. And I think in my mind, that's really about helping countries and governments and multi-stakeholder forums like these to understand what is international good practice and what are expectations that we all have. And secondly, capacity building is when you look at the technical level, at the operational level, that you can access resources, skills, expertise, and support from across the community, but also that the community can really ask you for your support and for sharing your skills and expertise. And I think that's where kind of the policy community can learn a lot from the CERT and the internet technical community, most of you hopefully here in the room today with us. That's it for me, Belt. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to some of the very good questions that were raised in the chat.
Thank you so much, Bart. So, ladies and gentlemen, so many questions, so little time. I would go with one round and see how many time left for if we can do a second round. But before we start discussing on the questions that already appeared on the chat box, I would like to invite and give the privilege for the audience who attend this session physically in the room whether they have questions to be asked to any of the panelists. Should they have one, kindly raise your hand. Not on Zoom, physically, of course. Going once. Going twice. Okay, let's go with the questions on Zoom. I would like to invite each of the panelists, starting from the order of speaker, so it goes from Eugene, Farlina, Fitri, and Bart, to pick their own questions and answer it. But before I do that, something that I have been noticing from the questions, that there seem to be a unifying element, yeah, some recurring topic that are questions by the attendees. For example, Sheila Jasmine asked whether capacity building and norms agreement in ASEAN is enough to carry out the missions of implementing the 11 norms. Lawrence questions whether the frameworks and initiatives in ASEAN should be embodied in an institution to carry out the norms. Or Deborah, who asked the questions rather directly, if I might say, that is multilateral arena still provides the best platform for the efforts towards advancing international cybersecurity. So this is a bit of an existential question, if I may say. Or Wafa Karisma, my colleague, who says that whether there is any unifying element that can be worked upon among Asian countries to drive certain initiatives to go forward. So, if I can summarize those commonly found pattern on our attendees, that I will have to ask to dear panelists: is ASEAN still the best way to carry out the norm in the region? How effective is ASEAN to embody the 11 norms? Is ASEAN and its mechanism the best way to carry out the norms? So, before you pick your own question to answer, I would like some of your brief comments regarding this common pattern of questions. Starting from Eugene, the floor is yours.
Oh, you're putting me on the spot, Belts. I think I'm going to answer like the first part of it. Like, is ASEAN still the best forum to do so? Well, the 11 norms, there is a domestic response capability, and then there's also a whole, you need everyone to pull together as well. So having ASEAN pull together is actually a good framework to ensure cybersecurity within ASEAN itself. And cooperation between ASEAN member states. And if we are, to be honest, if you're going to create an ASEAN CERT in the future, then you must first have the political commitment, the political will for all ASEAN states to pull together. So whether it's still useful to have a multilateral platform, I think it's still useful. I think the more people we have on board, the greater the agreement to these broad principles, the operationalization of these broad principles. I think that's important. But this does not discount bilateral agreements where two or even three states come together to say, look, we are going to define our relationship in this manner that's up to the states to decide. Whether ASEAN needs an institution, I am not completely sure because every state sees cyberspace differently, and I think it's still useful to use a domestic context lens to look at how you choose to define cybersecurity, and then cooperate from there and see the lowest common denominator, where your cooperation points can be. So that's my short comments. Yeah, in the interest of time, I shall stop there.
Thank you, Eugene. For Lena, short comments on that and questions of your choice, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Eugene, for actually building the flaw and the response. I think particularly something interesting that Eugene mentioned about the fact that it is actually a domestic situation. So I'm actually just going to extrapolate a bit from what Eugene actually said. So I think one of the questions that actually did try to ask about the critical infrastructure and actually address your question towards the end. So about the scorecard for critical infrastructure. So because every nation actually would actually have their own way of protecting the critical infrastructure, there's actually no unified step. Because perhaps if you were to actually, the broader question the broader response to what you were actually asking about ASEAN and the importance of ASEAN and norms is not the fact that you're actually looking at the norms as this forest. You actually have to look at the trees and the steps that's actually written in the trees. For instance, when it actually states things like there should be cert cooperation. So you actually have to build a cert. You have to actually build the cert capacity. When you're actually identifying certain things, for instance, to engage in responsible reporting of ICT vulnerabilities, you would actually need to build your institutions as well as your agencies that would actually be capable of doing so. And that is actually the norms is actually a guide in many ways. And while in previous times it would have actually been stated that the norms should actually be something binding and it should be a treaty, but if we were to actually treat it as a guide and a step-by-step guide, it becomes a bit more clearer when we're actually looking at practical implications. So to the question, I suppose, of my choice, back to what we were actually talking about, the scorecard, and then about the fact that different nations may actually have different types of practices when you're actually looking at how you would actually protect certain types of critical infrastructure. Also, because not every nation would actually have the same critical infrastructure. This does not create a one-size-fits-all when we're actually looking at the approaches. But if you are actually thinking of references for some, just for comparative studies, there is a SP's maturity report. I think that's actually done every year, as well as ITU's cybersecurity index, where some of the while it doesn't actually particularly highlight critical infrastructure, it actually also talks about things, it talks about the types of steps that would actually build your cybersecurity ecosystem. For instance, you're actually looking at cybersecurity laws, the ability for your agencies to actually enforce those laws. So it may not necessarily be critical infrastructure focused, but it would actually be a part of the ecosystem. I think, and then also I'll just probably tackle the second that's actually stated because my name is there. So then they were actually asking about sovereignty and then also about information sharing. I do apologize if it actually seems like I was quite bitter or I was actually quite sour that there is no such thing as a unifying element, I think, when we're actually looking at sharing practices. I think cybersecurity is actually it's not in a terrible place when we're actually looking at cooperation and collaborations in ASEAN, particularly today. And I think one of the reasons is because almost every nation in ASEAN, I think, would actually already have highlighted in their Industry 4.0 or Digital Economy Plan. And this would actually be inclusive of Myanmar in 2019. About the steps that they would actually be interested in when it comes to digitization, because that would actually be seen as the next step when it comes to growing their own prosperity and their own economy and building resilience in their systems. So with that comes hand in hand the fact that you actually need to ensure that your systems are actually safe, because if you actually are not practicing high cybersecurity in your own country and for your own systems, that makes it very difficult for people to actually trade with you, or for you to actually even for you to ensure your systems are operating. So it does go hand in hand, and I think in that sense, this cybersecurity would actually be an example of I think collaborative and cooperation efforts. It's just when it comes to difficulties for information sharing, sometimes it's actually not necessarily due to sovereignty. It can actually also be because of resources. It can also be because there's mismatches when it comes to agencies. So it's actually also in the space where it's actually still developing. I actually hope that helps.
Thank you, Verlina. Fitri, do you want to address the questions on the debate between human-centered cybersecurity and the national security aspect as a referent object of cybersecuritization? Also, your comment on the multilateralism, please.
Thank you. I firstly want to address your question regarding how whether ASEAN is still relevant, an organization that is formed 1967, where we all still in analog mode, whether in 2021 ASEAN is still relevant. I think as a region that is prone to be known as the area of great power contestation, ASEAN is still relevant in a way that in ASEAN DNA is conflict avoidance. So trying so hard not to have a cyber war that can translate in a kinetic war, as the region still have somewhat useful treaty like treaty, amity and cooperation, as well as zone of peace and neutrality. We understand the current geopolitical situation of heating up between great power rivalries. And I think what Bart mentioned about the non-intervention of the ASEAN member state also put a somewhat ASEAN member state to understand that when it is left on its own without ASEAN as an organization, it will be left as its weakest link to protect its own cyber security infrastructure. And therefore, having ASEAN as regional organization will leverage the ASEAN member state to actually seeking capacity building support, except if you're a big country that is a source of cybersecurity threat to other nations, such as North Korea, or the country that are known as a proxy for cyber attack. I'm not going to mention the name in the region, and country would want to provide cybersecurity, capacity building, cyber literacy program, as we know. So I think ASEAN is still useful for the ASEAN member countries, and as well, what is important as having that multilateral dimension in region would actually ties very well with the regionalization and nationalization of cyber norms that is adopted in the UN level. So you kind of have ASEAN as a platform to actually inform countries whereby their digitalization process and digital divide are still big, to understand what's going on in the world, and that their country is responsible to enact cyber norms, including, for example, the norms on human rights that I mentioned, and or the norms on protecting critical information that Farlina was mentioning. That's answering that question. In regards of I don't know, you were asking a specific question that I need to answer, but I am much more inclined to address the issue of the leak of information in the health system. And I want to say that although in Indonesia we have the PGS leak recently, the national health system, we're not the only country in the region that experienced it. So you don't have to be yes, Eugene raised his hand with its countries as.
Is that a good sign?
It's not a good sign, but I think we're in it together, If the strongest country and more advanced country, the developed country of the Southeast Asian region experienced it and it enabled to say the perpetrator or decided not to, I guess we're in the same boat, sort of. And I think how to fix it. I do a research to a country that is in 2008 as part of the ASEAN transnational crime project. And I asked, like, how does your country see cybercrime? Oh, no, look at these filing cabinets. We all have it non-digitalized, and that's the safest. But come COVID, now they still need to address that. So I guess, I think what we can do is securing is one of the norms, securing the supply chain, as well as the country are faced to in the challenge whether they want to create their own security infrastructure, cybersecurity infrastructure, or buy it from the supplier, and having that supplier to confirm that the security by design and respecting the requirement provided by the state would be ideal. So I guess I stop there. I'm taking too much time. Thank you, Albert.
Thank you so much, Fitri. But your turn, please.
Yeah, thanks, Belt, and thanks everyone for again the great questions. I really like the word of cyber securitization. That's what I'm going to remember and start using. Maybe as an answer to the question, is ASEAN relevant for this, or are multilateral, so intergovernmental institutions relevant? The best platform to discuss these kind of things, and probably my answer would be probably not. But I also think it's not a matter of what's the best platform. It's one of the platforms out of many where you can discuss issues around cybersecurity, e-safety, fighting cybercrime, et cetera, et cetera. So even kind of a forum like this is just an important platform, an important multi-stakeholder platform by which a community, in this case a predominantly Indonesian community, can demonstrate that it is concerned about this, that it recognizes that cyber and digitalization is an important issue, and there is generally a will and a proper intent to do something about it and to be a good member in the international community. I've been coming to Indonesia for the last couple of years, and I think that's one of the first times I was there when Paul Hukam was still kind of the government lead for cyber issues. One of the first things they said was, I think Indonesia is the first or the second in the global ranking of cybersecurity attacks or cyber incidents. And they showed, and I think BSSN still has this nice kind of map where it shows how many attacks are coming from which country, or actually from which IP address or which IP server. And I think that was really the first step to recognize that, hey, we accept that our economy and our IT infrastructure is susceptible to be used or misused for attack. It doesn't say that Indonesia is a bad actor in cyberspace, not at all. It just recognizes that there are certain vulnerabilities and that there is a willingness to do something about it. Hence the establishment of the BSSN as a central agency. Hence the effort to update certain laws and to introduce a new cybersecurity strategy. And I think all that kind of shows that a country like Indonesia, and sorry for picking you as an example, because I think it's a great example, it just shows at the various levels, at the political level, at the government level, but also the community has a good intent to improve cybersecurity and general awareness in the region, and that is willing to engage with actors outside of Indonesia. And I think that's really the main thing. But I think ASEAN is, as an organization, and the ASEAN Ministerial Conference and the new ASEAN Cyber Coordinating Committee. Please don't establish another forum or another institution, because there are already way too many. Are really critical bodies and forums to provide this link between what's happening in kind of at the UN level, where you have exactly the same debate whether it should be intergovernmental or more multi-stakeholder, and what's happening in each and every of our countries, and be that bridge not on everything, but mainly on issues that would affect our national security or our regional security and stability. And that's where ASEAN as a regional organization plays a very important role, not just for the ASEAN member states, but also for its dialogue partners, including Australia and many others. Thanks.
Thank you. But we've actually exceeding our allowed time, but allow me to borrow some more of your time, perhaps in the next 10 minutes, dear speakers and audience, because I would like to let each of the speakers, should they have a closing remarks, to let's say 1 or 2 minutes about the current state of things of cyber norms and its relationship with the regional mechanism. Yeah, I will start with Eugene. Should you have a very short and brief closing remarks on what we are going to do going forward?
Okay, so I will just reiterate what I said in closing for our presentation, is that ASEAN is really in a unique situation, unique leadership situation, where we can pull together on the operationalization of cyber norms, how we can affect cyber norms, the cyber norms trajectory in the world for the next for the foreseeable future, actually, through Singapore's chairmanship of the OEWG process. So, how ASEAN member states choose to proceed on this front requires a lot of political will. And I also agree with Bart that we do have a lot of acronyms and alphabet soup already. So I think now it's a time for consolidation. It's a time for a whole of government approach and a whole of ASEAN approach on how to tackle cybersecurity and cyber norms issues. Yeah, thanks, Belts.
Thank you, Eugene. Farlina, please.
Thank you so much, and also thank you to the participants for the great questions. I think it's amazing that you actually you are so engaged on the platform, whether it's actually physical or it's actually virtual. I think something interesting that's been happening in the last year and this year is, of course, like we actually have COVID that actually encourages a lot of nations to actually digitize and to digitize more aggressively. And in many ways, ASEAN. Even from the time that there was the statement of supporting the 11 norms in principle in 2018, there was the process to actually develop the cybersecurity infrastructure that we're actually looking in the region is actually still in much of the assessment, development, and I think capacity building phase. So there is the part where there is a lot of retrospective about looking at some of these norms to actually understand what it means, to actually look at the supply chain. Do I actually even have the procurement procedures that's necessary for me to actually look at, for me to think if something that I'm buying is actually problematic for my critical infrastructure or just for my usage. So the government's actually in a place where they actually are looking at their own processes, because that's a lot of where it begins. And that would actually be the case, I think, for many of the nations, at least for the next 2 to 3 years. And I think, but that being said, a lot of the cybersecurity issues and threats around it will actually not change, because if it will actually continue to develop quite rapidly, because if we were to actually look at technologies and how technologies would be more automated, and then you would actually have threats that are going to be artificial. So in those sense, there is actually, the frontiers may actually change, and the goalposts would actually continue, it would actually keep on going further. And as much as my presentation was a lot about critical infrastructure, there would actually be the question about how far is the protection of critical infrastructure going to be, like which part of the infrastructure is critical? How far is it going to be that governments would actually be able to dedicate the type of resources that would be needed to actually protect it? So I think it is actually a game that actually seems to keep on playing by itself. And I think it also means that there's a lot for us to actually anticipate. So I think that would just be all. Thank you.
Thank you, Farlina, for such strong points. Fitri, your closing statement, please.
Thank you. I think I would like to actually highlight my point on how the ASEAN cyber norm operationalization and on human rights is still grasping. As I mentioned before, the ASEAN member states see human rights as depends on how each country understand, accept, and usage the terms of human rights. Not all the countries appreciate it as much as others. And of course, there's a question from the ICT Philippine Cybersecurity, Raymond Medina, asking about a specific case, for example, child exploitation in the cyberspace. Countries are grasping to create legislation to pursue and address the perpetrator of such trespasses of human rights, and I think the countries in Southeast Asia is not alone in facing the rapid change brought by technology, and perhaps it would be useful to have legislation to say that human rights law that applicable in the physical world that a country have also applicable in the digital space. That would be safe, but again, how does the devil is in the details? How can countries would enforce that then if it doesn't have the capability to do so? And again, I would pursue or highlight that capacity building program is necessary in the region. I think that's for me. Thank you, Balt.
Thank you so much, Fitri. And Bart, to wrap up the session.
Yeah, thanks everyone for these great comments, and maybe I'll just build on what Fitri just mentioned, and my takeaways would be don't overhype things that you see in the media or that are coming in terms of cyber threats or in terms of what's coming from a fantasy concept like the UN norms or another ASEAN ministerial statement. Don't overhype it and don't overcomplicate it either. And continue. Let's continue to use our common sense and be really critical about what we see and where it fits into either a bigger picture or a smaller picture. At the same time, I think it's also important to realize that we should not try to fight the technology. I think one of the comments made in the chat box was technology is changing all the time, and we will never be able to keep up with that in terms of regulation or policy or whatsoever. And we shouldn't, because the technology is not the problem. It's how we use it as individuals. When we talk about, let's say, our own online safety and how we buy online and communicate online, it's about how we use it as organizations and as governments in terms of how we respect human rights and how we ensure data privacy. And it's how we use it at our states, and that we're not using the technology in irresponsible manners against other states or for malicious purposes. So it's really, let's say, upon ourselves, individually, organizationally, as a nation, as an economy, as the government, and as an international community, to make sure that we use it responsibly. And that's a lot of common sense, and I don't think there is lots of disagreement amongst nations in the world, and particularly in Southeast Asia, in terms of where are the limits of what is responsible and what is irresponsible. And then secondly, let's be more open and more articulate in our opinions about what we think is right and what we think is not right. Because the more informed opinions we can add to the debate, the more the regional debate and the international debate is also representative of what we here in our region think is required. Thanks.
Thank you, Bart, for concluding the discussion part of the session strongly. We are now reaching the end of the breakout sessions for Southeast Asia Internet Governance Forum Day 2. But before we wrap up the session completely, I would like to have a nice photo sessions between the moderator and speakers. I would very much prefer if you would all join here with me in Bali to have that photo session, but sure, I will settle for Zoom as well. Yeah, so the organizers, we can begin the photo session. Okay, I will count to 3 for the panelists. I've seen all of them in in pose already. So please take screenshot when I say 3. So 1, 2, 3. Okay. And one a bit informal one. 1, 2, 3. There you are. Okay. Thank you. I hope I see you, the panelists, in person very soon. With all the golden nuggets of the sessions, I would not be daring to draw any single conclusion. I just want to reiterate the recurring points that cyber norms and its operationalizations requires both a strong political commitment and both a strong way to operationalize and put it into practice. And synchronization between what's happening in the international stage and what's happening in the regional stage and the national stage is a continuous effort, and therefore what has been said also repeatedly in these discussions, and therefore highlighting its importance is that the element of multidimensionalism and multi-stakeholderism of the issues still needs to be is a work in progress, which I believe is an issue that is worth discussing in Southeast Asia Internet Governance Forum 2022. And that's it. That is the end of the breakout session. Thank you, dear speakers. Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Falina. Thank you, Fitri. Thank you, Bart, for sharing your insights and somehow how each of your 4 presentations actually builds up to one great picture. I don't know how you organize it across islands and across regions, but it somehow complements each other. Thank you, the audience who joined us via Zoom, YouTube, and in attending the event physically, for engaging from the beginning to the end and throwing us with great questions. And last but not least, thank you, Cominfo, the Ministry for ICT, for organizing and making this event possible. My name is Balthazar Krisatya from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Indonesia. See you in IGF 2022.